Okay, good evening and welcome tonight to U.S. Army Garrison Stuttgart's Women's History Month event. And I'm thankful to have members joining us both via Zoom and via Facebook Live. And so a brief admin note up front as we get to the moderated question and answer period. I'd ask that those of you that are on Zoom that you will submit your questions via the Q&A function rather than the chat screen. And so for those of you that are participating via Facebook, I'd ask that you put your comments in the comments section. We have people that are monitoring those, and they will move your questions from that into the Q&A aspect so that it can be seen by the other participants as well. And I'd ask that you please put your first name along with your question. And so with those brief admin notes aside, it's my pleasure to introduce General Steve Townsend, the commander of U.S. Africa Command, who will provide tonight's opening remarks. Sir, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks, Colonel Condrey, for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak to our audience tonight. As he said, I'm General Steve Townsend. I'm the commander of United States Africa Command, and I'm dialing in with all of you here in Stuttgart over at Kelly Barracks. So when I was approached a month or two ago and asked if I would be willing to give opening remarks, I said, absolutely, I would be happy to do that. I thought it was important, an important event, and that one of our military senior leaders ought to open this important event. So I was thrilled to be doing the opening remarks for our Women's History Observance tonight. This weekend I was sitting, maybe it was Friday or Saturday, I was sitting around thinking about what I was going to say. And I got a call from my staff asking me if I'd seen the Stuttgart Garrison's Facebook page today. And I said, no, why? And they said, well, sir, have you ever heard of the term mansplaining? So they read me some of the comments that were trending on the Facebook page, and I've learned some new vocabulary this week. So anyway, I appreciate the fact that many of you have rightfully observed, and some of you have pointed out that maybe the initial flyer for this event came across as a little bit tone deaf. It had three men's faces on it, and one of them was me. I didn't even know I was on the flyer until it was pointed out to me. But be that as it may, we're all here tonight to celebrate a great event. We're going to recognize the valiant women of the vote who refuse to be silent. We're going to celebrate the contributions of women in advancing our country and our society. And we're going to hear a great discussion tonight about how gender equality is everybody's business, not just a women's issue. It's a man issue and it's a leadership issue. And that's really why, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's really why we had a flyer with these two of our gentlemen, our guest speakers tonight, because they're authors of this book. They're authors of a book called Athena Rising. They're also authors of this book, Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. I'm not plugging this book, but I did find myself preparing tonight. I was provided a copy of the book. I started flipping through the book. My plan was to just scan it. I actually wound up reading most of the book this weekend. Pretty good, actually. The whole thesis of the book, and I don't want to steal our guest speaker's thunder, but basically it says men have a role in empowering women. And not only does it explain what that role is, but it explains how to do it. So if there are men out there watching tonight, and I hope there are, this book is for you to read. And for the women out there, you might want to consider pointing your man in your life to that book, or the supervisor in your life to that book, because I think it's useful. I learned a thing or two from reading it. We're going to be introduced to those speakers here in a little bit. Dr. David Smith, professor of sociology at the U.S. Naval War College, and Dr. Brad Johnson, professor of psychology at the U.S. Naval Academy, and they're the authors of the book. We also have a team of women who weren't depicted on the flyer, who are facilitating this event. Ms. Kate McNeely, our deputy garrison commander, Ms. Stephanie Dantzler, Deputy Director for Cyberspace Operations at U.S. European Command, and Colonel Lynn Ray, Operations Division Chief at European Command. This event was put together a team effort from our Stuttgart Garrison team, AFRICOM staff, and UCOM staff. Thanks to everybody who pulled this together. Okay, so workplace allies is the topic of today's discussion, and it highlights that making sure every member of the team is empowered to contribute to their full potential. And this is a shared responsibility that also has shared advantages for the team. Our team is at its best when everyone is treated equally, fairly, and with respect. An inclusive environment is not just morally right, it's in line with our service values. It's ultimately best for the team as a whole, for our team members, and for our mission. The idea is simple enough. Creating that team environment creates constant work and can be nuanced and challenging, but we'll take that up in our discussion today, which is going to be good. So we're also going to celebrate some trailblazers here in our discussions. It's Women's History Month, and we should all really be proud together, I think, of some great women leaders who've been recently nominated for the rank of 4-star general in our armed forces. Air Force Lieutenant General Jacqueline Van Oost has been nominated to be the next commander of U.S. Transportation Command and promotion to 4 stars. Army Lieutenant General Laura Richardson, who I know personally, has been nominated to be the next commander of U.S. Southern Command and also promotion to 4 stars. They will follow in the footsteps retired General Ann Dunwoody, who was the first woman in U.S. history to become a 4-star general in November 2008. And also right on the heels of someone you saw on the screen, if you watch the video there right at the end, our new Vice President, Kamala Harris, the first woman to become the Vice President in the United States. Okay, finally, thanks to the Stuttgart Garrison for hosting this program. Thanks to our guest speakers and all of our attendees for your continued work on the important topic of gender equality and diversity and participating in this Women's History Month program. Thanks. And back to our narrator.
Thank you, sir. So good evening and welcome. As the general cited, my name is Kate McNeely, and I am the deputy to the garrison commander to my left. I have the pleasure of introducing our panelist and moderator for this evening's event. Ms. Stephanie Dantzler will be our moderator, and she, as the general indicated, is the deputy director for Cyberspace Integrated Operations Planning Element, UCOM. I believe that she might also have attended U.S. Naval War College in the school year 2017-2018, so I want to get that plug in. Ms. Dantzler will be posing tough questions from you all to build on the idea of building workplace allies. Dr. Johnson, so our panelists for the evening are Dr. Johnson and Dr. David Smith. Dr. Brad Johnson is professor of psychology at the United States Naval Academy and a faculty associate in the Graduate School of Education at Johns Hopkins University. He is a clinical psychologist and former lieutenant commander in the Navy Medical Service Corps. He is recipient of the Johns Hopkins University Teaching Excellence Award and has received distinguished mentor awards from the National Institutes of Health and American Psychological Association. Dr. Johnson has authored numerous publications, give or take 13 books, in the area of mentoring, professional ethics, and counseling. He is the co-author of Athena Rising, How and Why Men Should Mentor Women, and Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. What was of interest to me was what sparked his interest in this topic and this subject. And it really is threefold. His father was a full-on partner at home. He and his younger sister both entered the Navy, and he observed that her experiences in the workplace were very different from his own, and his own journey as a researcher and writer on the topic of mentoring relationships. Dr. Smith is an associate professor of sociology at the U.S. Naval War College. And he is a former Navy pilot and has led diverse organizations of women and men. As a sociologist trained in military sociology and social psychology, he has focused his research on gender, work, family issues, including gender bias in performance evaluations, dual career families, military families, women in the military, and retention for women. Dr. Smith is also the co-author of Athena Rising and Good Guys, and has written numerous journals and book chapters, and I can believe that from the Naval War College. What sparked his interest in writing on this topic revolved primarily around long conversations with his wife, a Navy officer, and her work experiences, and the tugging of his own inner sense of justice over time with military assignments that were more diversified as women were integrating into combat squadrons and ships. Please welcome Ms. Dantzler, Dr. Johnson, and Dr. Smith.
You're muted, Stephanie.
Thank you. Good evening, Stuttgart. Thank you, General Townsend, Colonel Condrey, Ms. McNeely, for your opening remarks. Before I turn the conversation over to Dave and Brad, I just wanted to address the elephant in the room, similar to General Townsend's comments. For starters, this event was organized by all women. As a part of Women's History Month planning, a group of women came together and recommended the topic of workplace allies to the garrison leadership. We thought it would be a welcome change to include men in a Women's History Month program, an effort to honor women's accomplishments by acknowledging the need for continued work in gender equality as a leadership issue, not a women's issue, and to have that discussion with men from their perspective on what men can do to be better allies for women in the workplace. We also had invited a few female subject matter experts for the topic, but unfortunately they were not available. In the end, we believe this topic was a needed paradigm shift and would be well received even if the panel were only men, because after all, the message here is for men to step up and do a better job advocating for women in the workplace. Well, in hindsight, 2020, the optics of the flyer to advertise the event was not a good message. So mea culpa on behalf of the entire team. We live, we learn from our mistakes, and hopefully we grow. Now that we're all here tonight, let's go ahead and get to the business of having a conversation about allyship. How do we engage, involve men in identifying and working with women to break that glass ceiling? Changing those cultural norms takes all sides to engage. We're all up for a challenge. Are you? At this time, I would like to welcome the co-authors of Good Guys, David Smith and Brad Johnson.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the warm introduction, and thanks to General Townsend and Colonel Condrey for their introduction today. It is so refreshing to see senior male leaders talking about a topic that in many ways they're uncomfortable talking about. And this is part of the conversation around what allyship is all about. Is often we have to learn to get comfortable being uncomfortable and immersing ourselves in this topic. As you heard, Brad and I have some very personal connections to the work that we do, and certainly in our research as well. We figured this out, in the many years where we taught together at the Naval Academy before I went on to the Naval War College, and recognized that there was a really significant need to start changing the conversation, reframing it, as you heard, around this being not gender issues and women's leadership initiatives, but really more around leadership issues and how men and women, we have to come together to solve these inequities out there. And we started in particular around the area that is Brad's research focus, and looking at gender inequities around mentoring and sponsoring, which led to the first book, Athena Rising. Came out in 2016. It's really interesting, about a year later, as Me Too went widespread around the world, Brad and I found ourselves being pulled more into these broader conversations, not just on the very specific, narrow, important areas and functions of mentoring and sponsoring, but also as we think about allyship and how can we all show up and be better allies in the workplace, no matter what level of leadership you're at or what your role is. There are things that we can be doing every single day to make it better for everyone. And so we set out to do the research for that, which led to our latest book, Good Guys. And I'll let Brad tell you a little bit more about that. But I would also just like to say that I think, around this International Women's Day and Women's History Month this year, that in particular for the theme this year, Choose to Challenge, I think how appropriate, in particular, as we had an opportunity to see around the Facebook community to choose to challenge, and as they should. And I think that was, all of their experience have told them that they should challenge that. And we appreciate that. And I also think that as part of that, this is where great humility in your leaders out there is really helpful. And I think that's a keen or a very smart part of what it looks like to be an ally out there. And the last part is that allyship is a journey, and we'll see more of that today as we go through this. And we're all in different places, but we all have to have that humility and act and understand that we're not perfect and we're going to make mistakes. But when we do, we're going to learn from them, acknowledge them, and then share them so that we can all be better from there. Brad, you want to tell them a little bit more about the books?
Sure. Yeah. I'm glad to be here with you, by the way. And Steph, I heard from Dave that you are one of his favorite students of all time. So glad to actually be doing this with you as well. I want to just kind of give a sense of how we approached the research. So, Dave and I have been at this for, 8 years or so now. And, as Dave said, there are things that are both academic and personal that pull us into this work. But when we first started sharing with colleagues at the Naval Academy, hey, we're really quite excited about writing maybe a book for men about how to be more effective mentors and sponsors with women in the workplace. People would look at us, because we're two older white guys, and they would look at us and say, you realize you're men, right? And you want to write a book about mentoring women. Is that a good idea? And we really did get that feedback, and it's really important. We do recognize we're men, but just so you know, the methodology we used in both books was to go out and interview lots and lots of women and ask them about their experiences. So this was qualitative research. We chose women across professions, across industries, most of them very, very senior, including in the military. And we asked them questions related to what does it look like when a guy really shows up in behavioral terms? What does he do, right? If we're talking about allyship, what do those guys do that you most appreciate or notice? If we're talking about mentoring or sponsoring, again, behaviorally, what do these guys do? So for the most part, both Athena Rising and Good Guys are essentially toolboxes for men that were, sort of from the voices of women. What do women wish men knew more about, and how could we men get better? And so that's really what we'd like to kind of give some of away today, some best practices and a little bit of what women told us in the interviews, and just delighted to be here. So we'll turn it back to you, Dave, to kind of kick off with a little background.
Yeah, I think it's important to start out with kind of the why. Why is this so important to all of us, no matter what industry or profession we're in? And the research and the evidence is really clear that the more gender balance, more gender equity you have in your organization, not only at the bottom, but all the way to the top of the senior leadership teams and in the boardrooms out there for the civilian side of this, that again, the more successful your company and your organizations are, the better decisions that you make, the more innovative, the more creative you are. It's just a better place to work. The corporate world looks at this and there's a bottom line to this for them in terms of profits and losses. But I would also remind you that even in our work around national security, there's a bottom line for us too. Right. And there are national security objectives and metrics and outcomes that are so critically important. The more women that are involved when it comes to national security work, the more likely we are to have lasting peace agreements out there, the less interstate or intrastate violence we're going to find out there. And certainly these peace agreements last longer when we do this out there, and there's more trust within our governments. Yet we still find that women are excluded in so many different ways in every sort of practice and process that's out there. And this starts all the way from the how do we include them in the hiring and recruiting to and then how do we advance them and promote them all the way up into the senior areas and retain them in those places. And certainly on the civilian side, the pay equity gap is alive and well out there. So it's really interesting as you think about this, about how does this connect with men in particular? How do we get more men to see this as being something that they ought to be involved in? Let me share one quick story with you. We had the great opportunity to interview Ambassador Don Steinberg for Good Guys, and Don is an incredible advocate for gender equity out there, and he shared what I thought was a very kind of a humbling experience and learning experience on his own part. And when he was the special envoy and then later the ambassador to Angola, back in the late 90s, he talked about the peace process and how he was so proud when they had originally negotiated the first peace agreement out there, and a reporter had asked him, "Hey, did you include, was this a gender neutral, or how did you approach this from a gender perspective?" "Oh yeah, it's gender neutral in terms of how we approached it." And he said, looking back on that later on, he recognized that, well, it was gender neutral, but we didn't really include women. We never thought about women. We didn't actively, from their perspective, discriminate against women, but they didn't include women in any part of the process. And he said, as it turned out, of course, that the peace process fell apart, and about within 6 to 9 months later, they were back at war again. And it was because they had approached it the same way they had always done this. And this is, hey, we're going to bring all the bad guys with guns to the table, and we're going to negotiate. We're going to forgive them for all the crimes they committed in the past, and probably the ones they're going to commit over the course of the next year. And again, the peace agreements won't last if we continue to do it that way and women aren't involved. And he said it was really important to him when he saw as these skirmishes and things kept flaring up, and he's like, why don't we have the intel? Why don't we know about these things? And somebody finally came to him and said, look, the people who know this information, who have or in the network to understand it, it's the women, because they understand the information is passed through the marketplace, but you have no women involved anywhere in the process. So he said for him, this was just a light bulb moment that really we have got to begin to learn how to integrate women in everything that we do.
So one of the mantras you hear from Dave and I a lot is that men really are, in many ways, a missing ingredient to getting to equity in the workplace more rapidly. And, if there was ever an example of this, there was this huge study by Boston Consulting Group just a couple of years ago across hundreds of companies asking women, is your company making genuine progress on gender diversity and inclusion? And by far the biggest predictor variable of whether women said yes or not to that was whether they saw men championing gender inclusion and diversity. When that was yes, 96% of women said, yep, my company gets it, we're making progress, versus only 30% when they saw men not involved. So, this is just one piece of data about why men are so important here. Nonetheless, we find men reluctant. We find men standing on the sidelines. We find men not engaging, mentoring, sponsoring, loudly supporting equity in the workplace. And when you ask men, the men that we talk to will say things like, well, I don't know exactly what this looks like. I don't know what allyship means. I don't know how to execute it in the workplace. There are other men who are anxious, right? I don't want to step in it. Don't want to say the wrong thing. Don't want to be falsely accused. Post Me Too, you're hearing all the false narratives from men in the workplace that women are dangerous or scary to talk to, right? I don't want to get Me Too. You hear this quote. There's some false narratives about Me Too. It's actually really straightforward. Women are asking to come to work and not be assaulted or harassed. Really low bar for dudes to get over. So part of allyship, I think, is pushing back on this. And another big piece of this, if I'm a guy who has anxiety about interacting fully with women in the workplace, loudly mentoring and sponsoring women, I probably need to do my own exposure therapy. And I'm sharing this as a clinical psychologist. There's only one treatment for anxiety, and that's exposure. So how about having more meetings, more mentoring, more coffee engagements with your female colleagues? And I guarantee you, if you do that reliably, your anxiety is going to decline. And, just one last piece of this message to men. We often think there's these great studies showing that when you go out and ask people anonymously in the workplace, hey, how attracted do you think people are to you, that you work with? It turns out one gender consistently radically overestimates us. I'm guessing you know which one. Men tend to think that women are more interested in them romantically or otherwise. And so message to all of us men, she's really not that into you. So let's actually just keep it really professional, level the playing field when it comes to our engagement. And I think we go a long way toward equity there.
Let's give you just a little sense of what we're talking about when we talk about the specific parts of allyship and what it is. And so it was very clear in our research that allyship kind of took on two major areas. And let me talk to you first about the first part, and that's interpersonal allyship. And the men that we talked to said that this is really the easy part, because this is really about how do I hold myself individually accountable for doing the work and being in the types of relationships that I'm in, and being supportive, being collaborative, supporting gender equity and gender fairness and justice in the workplace. And that's really kind of the easy part, because I only have to hold myself accountable. And the specific actions that they were really talking about here was really, they said, you know, to begin to fix things in the workplace. Right? We're not here to fix women. We're here to fix the workplace and create change to make it equitable. I have to understand and develop an awareness of how other people experience the workplace differently than I do. The things that I don't see, that I'm not aware of, I have to begin to understand and to be able to see those things. That starts with self-education. So it's attending events like today and Women's History Month. It's reading books, reading articles out there, beginning to understand, look at it with the lens of how do other people experience this workplace differently, and then connecting it back into my own workplace. Where do I see some of these same common connections, same commonalities going on there? And then eventually having the humility to understand that, hey, I've got a lot to learn here and I don't really understand everything, is then approaching some of my close female colleagues to ask them about this and their own experiences, and how do you experience the workplace different? And that can be kind of awkward for some guys sometimes. And so guys would tell us that, you know, sometimes you even have to just ask to ask. Is it okay if I ask you about this? Or what would be one thing that I could do this week that would make your experience here better? And really kind of beginning to understand and develop some empathy as we go through that. The number one skill that women talked about was listening. And this came from both books. Whether it was talking about mentors or allies, they most appreciated in their allies was listening skills. And the one thing that they wish men would develop and be better at were our listening skills, and listening with an intent to understand again, and not necessarily to fix a problem, not necessarily to fix her. Right? They have to begin to understand this problem. As we develop that empathy, then we can begin to think about, all right, so where are the places that I can begin to create change to make it better for everyone? They also said it was really important, don't make assumptions that, hey, just because I'm a woman, I therefore must, you fill in the blank. Again, not making assumptions about who people are, recognizing that, again, women are not monoliths just like men. We're not all the same. We don't all have the same experiences. And so we have to be attuned to that. And again, in particular for women, I would say that we all know that women of color have very different experiences in the workplace. And we heard that over and over again, that the intersectional, the aspects around race and gender in particular, is something that we have to begin to be more thoughtful about. Guys need more feedback. We need feedback to close the loop on. In many cases, we think we're being good allies and we're doing the work around creating gender equity, because again, most men actually do believe in gender equity, but we're not always doing everything that we think we're doing, or not doing it as effectively as we think we're doing it. In some cases, it might even be backfiring in a variety of different ways. And so we need that feedback. And so we have to have these close friendships and close mentoring relationships and others, so that we can get that kind of feedback and be able to apply it out there. And then finally, I would say situational awareness is the last part of this, and beginning to apply all of this as we begin to observe and see how it works in the workplace. Then how can we speak up? How can we then become more public allies out there? And I'll let Brad talk to you a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the second part, we'll kind of wrap up here shortly. The second part of being a great ally, beyond the interpersonal things that Dave was just referring to, was really the public systemic. And I'll just share with you that this is harder for men across the board. You know, the interpersonal part about how I show up in relationship every day with my female colleagues, that's holding myself accountable. That's really genuinely the easy part. The tough part is when I have to publicly put skin in the game. And a good example of this, we've all been there. You're in a meeting, a sexist comment gets made, an egregiously biased, joke is told, or, possibly even something sexually harassing. And we freeze, right? We're all uncomfortable. We're looking out of the corner of our eyes, wondering, is someone going to say something? And we don't. And the research on bystander paralysis shows that if I don't say something in a couple of seconds, the moment's going to be lost. And so I have to be willing to disrupt. Dave and I have this technique we love to use called the ouch technique, right? So there's that sexist joke, and within 2 seconds, I just got to say, ouch, right? The beauty of that is it buys me another couple seconds while every pair of eyes in the room look my way, like, what's wrong with you? Now I have to articulate what's wrong, what didn't land the right way with me. And I got to use I statements. I can't say, hey, Dave, dude, there are women in the room. No, that happens too often. That's not real allyship. What I'm essentially saying is that was a hilarious joke, and you can say it when women are not in the room. I need to own what doesn't land with me. I need to be clear about it. I need to be willing to disrupt. Another piece of this is confronting other men, right? And we heard from men, this is not easy. I'm afraid of losing my man card or getting, violating the bro code. And so guys, don't do this. Well, again, I have to do this. Part of allyship. I think one question is, do I do it in the now, right now, in the meeting when that joke has just been told? I think for some people, I do need to do it, especially guys who have gotten the message before and not heeded it. They're serial misogynists. What they said was so inappropriate, it's likely to be really damaging to the culture. I'm going to call them out right now. And Dave and I have a hashtag for this, hashtag bro no. I got to have the bro no intervention right there in the meeting. There are other times when what was said was not so egregious. Maybe I have a relationship with this guy and I'm going to go to him afterward, close the door and say, bro, no. When you said that, everyone cringed. Let me tell you why. And you got to get better. This is really part of your leadership brand. You got to improve. Last thing I'll say from the public side, and we'll kind of wrap up here, is I got to be loud in sponsoring women. We know from all the data that women get less sponsorship. Part of the reason is men are reluctant to be loudly talking about women. And I've got to get over that. I've got to recognize the talented junior women around me and then litmus test for myself. Am I talking about her when she's not in the room? Am I telling other people how great she is and her work? Am I telling other people she should be in line for the next big thing? If I'm not her raving fan, I'm probably doing her a disservice. So, gut check for all of us men who work with talented women, and that's all of us. Are you doing the sponsorship equally? Or are you loudly sponsoring women? So that's something I can aspire to. And then, Dave, maybe we can just wrap up with, the one thing that I think shocks men when they ask us where can they begin with allyship. Maybe you can offer that, and we'll turn it back over to Steph.
Yeah, we heard this over and over again, and it does make a lot of sense, I think, as you think about it. But believe it or not, where do you start? You start at home. Gender equity, being an ally, starts at home. And again, for so long, women have done the lion's share. They've been burdened with so much of the domestic responsibilities, and that's certainly become worse through the pandemic, where women are doing 2 to 3 times that. And domestic responsibilities are one piece of it. Childcare is another. Today, certainly homeschooling has become even the third shift for many women out there. And if we as men aren't doing our fair share, it's really hard, right, to begin to create allyship and some sort of a gender equity in the workplace. And that includes in supporting our partners' careers and making sure that we're fully doing that. And then as we go back into the workplace, making sure that, again, people see that. Because, again, I think it's really obvious when guys in the workplace sling on their ally cape and, that they're not doing it at home. It's pretty obvious because they're not sharing that responsibility and they're not talking about it. And you're certainly not seeing them do it. And then the final thing of this is that I think as parents, it's a responsibility we have for raising the next generation, because it makes a difference in how they perceive their roles when they get into the workplace, when they grow up. And certainly our sons have more gender inclusive perspective of gender roles when they get into the workplace. And for our daughters, when they see their dads being all in equitable, allies at home, they're more likely to persist in their careers, reach their career goals and dreams. And the research shows they're more likely to go into non-traditional professions such as ours, right? So they're more male dominated. So if we're going to get there and get there with the next generation, we've got to be doing it at home too. Looking forward to our conversation tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And when I read your book initially, I coming out of school at the War College, and as I'm reading your second book, and I'm laughing, and I shouldn't be laughing, but the women that are telling these experiences that they're having in the workplace, and I'm just like, this has happened to me, where you're sitting in the room and you're interrupted, you're ignored, you have a great idea and completely discredited for it. And then, someone else, male, gives that same idea, and it's like, good job, pat on the back. And as a female, being the only person in the room, I'm lucky if I'm at the table. At the side, not so much. If I'm at the head of the table, it's a lot better. But being one of the only women in the room, it is so hard. And for me to speak up and to correct someone, then it comes across where I might be a bitch, and it's not a good thing. And so you have to find that balance. So if to have advocates in the room, so what do you say to the men out there when they're seeing this happen, or I'm in the meeting and it's like, gentlemen, and I'm looking around going, oh, I guess I'm a gentleman too. So there's all these little nuances, and sometimes I don't even think that men realize they're doing it. But, how do you self-correct? And what would you recommend to just be attuned to those things?
Yeah, that's such a huge question, Steph. And I think we've got like a whole section of our book on this, Dave. The whole situational awareness thing. And Steph, you're right on. When we interview men, we often find that so many of the things that women told us, like many of the examples you just referred to, these things go over guys' heads. They're just not seeing it. Because I'm not the recipient. It doesn't happen to me. I miss it completely. And that's where I have to, make a real concerted commitment to do this self-education. And I can do that in a lot of ways, right? I can read books. I can watch all kinds of great YouTube stuff on gender in the workplace. I can also check in with my female colleagues. And so, just as one example, if I'm in that meeting with you, Steph, and I see some of that happening because I've been trying to improve my gender intelligence a little bit, one thing I could do beyond maybe disrupting it in some way, like, I can say, hey, Dave, dude, you just interrupted Steph for the second time. Could we let her finish her thought? These are pretty easy. But if I'm in a situation where I don't get to do that, I can at least come to you afterward and say, Steph, I'm noticing that you've been interrupted frequently. Does this happen a lot in the meetings that you're in? And how could I contribute to stopping that? Because I don't want to step on your toes. I don't want to have it be perceived as me rescuing you, but I'd really love to collaborate and make sure as a kind of, we'll do a pre-game meeting right before the next meeting. And let's think about how are we going to stop that and what role can I play? And would you mind if I call some things out? I'd like to kind of collaborate with you on that, but boy, that takes me getting more situationally aware and actually recognizing them.
Yeah. And that collaboration would go so far, because to have that conversation, because a lot of times, you don't even know that it's happening in the room. I'm attuned to it because I'm the only one in the room, where other people may not be attuned to it. And, it would be appreciative, because even for another woman to call it out in the room, it normally isn't going to go over that well. But I think that collaboration has to start. And when I was reading the book, I'm thinking I could be really bitter about this, and I could, go on a man hater trip. And that's not me. I'm all about partnering and collaborating and how do we move things forward together. And when I read the book, I was like, because why would a woman want to read this book? It's the title of a man. And I'm like, I want to read the book because I want to understand men, how they think, and then how can Stephanie advocate for men to advocate for women. And so that was the approach that I took, because we're not going to move forward if we don't have these tough conversations, and that collaboration is key. So while we're talking, I want to do a poll. So if they could pop up the first poll for me. And everyone that's online, you'll have an opportunity to answer, and then we'll give the results. The poll is, are men allies for women in your workplace?
Do we get to respond too, Steph?
Yeah, you sure do. And I don't know if you can see the results, but they're coming in right now. And so yes, no, sporadically, or not sure. And you can probably already figure out, what is the answer. And right now, 57% is sporadically. So, no surprise there. So tell me, what was one of the biggest surprises that you've had so far in your research? And did you ever step on it and realize that, man, I just shouldn't have done that? And then how did you recover?
Wow. How many times do we just step in it? I don't know. We have a couple hours. But I think this is really key back to the journey, right? That remembering that allyship really is a journey, and yeah, we're all kind of in different places, and you find people who are just kind of really apathetic about the whole conversation, or don't care, right? And then you got people who are interested, but they're really not doing anything. They're just not sure. This is the group of guys that we often find are just, hey, I'm all about gender equity, but I don't know where to start. I don't know where to begin. I don't know what to do. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to offend. I don't want to be penalized, for doing something out there. And I always remind men in particular that the minute you feel like you're putting yourself in harm's way or accepting some risk here, that's when you're really doing allyship. Because if you're not accepting a little bit of risk, then you're probably not being a true public ally out there, because it will feel like it costs a little bit when you put yourself out there. There's some risk associated with, gosh, how will people respond to that? How will people perceive me in that? I'll just, let the guys in on a particular, something that I think most women probably already know. And for the guys that, when we confront or disrupt, we call out something, right, that happens in the workplace, we don't get penalized. And, at worst, it's really kind of neutral. When the research shows around performance evaluations that for men, it's kind of it's more neutral. In some cases it's mixed, and we actually do see kind of a bump up in terms of how they're perceived, because what happens when a guy does that? Well, suddenly he's a gender champion. He's a gender advocate, so he's doing great things. So he might get a bump up. Unequivocally, if women do it, right, you are going to be penalized. And the research is really clear on that, because it's perceived as self-interest in that way. And so that's why, again, back to the conversation, why do we need to work together on this, is because, again, these penalties and how they work, are part of the equation out there. But so many guys just miss that. They miss the opportunity. There's so many benefits that, this is often, as it should be, focused around advancing equity and advancing women. But there's a with them in here. There's a what's in it for the dudes out there, that, hey, the research, again, really clear. And Brad and I found the same thing, is that guys when they have more of these interactions or doing more allyship, they're mentoring more diversely when it comes to women and having female mentors. They have increased access to information. Right. So always good to have more information in the jobs that we have. They have more diverse networks, again, exposure to that. And I think the most critical part of this from a leadership side of things is that we find that they have enhanced interpersonal skills. So more empathy, more emotional intelligence, better communication skills, again, all make you better leaders. And the minute we can begin to recognize that, we can do more of it. And I think the other thing for guys to remember is that, oh, by the way, those are things that traverse, your entire lifespan and all the domains of your life as well. So when you leave work at the end of the day, whenever that is, you get to take those home with you. And so they also make you better parents, better partners when you go home. So again, I think there's so much more to this and how we perceive what it is and what it is we're actually doing, that we've got to have more conversations about it.
Yeah, and Steph, you asked about us stepping in it and making mistakes. Maybe this whole flyer for this event is one great example. I'm sure that if Dave and I saw the flyer, we were so busy with we just didn't pay attention, or notice. But we should have looked at that carefully and said, "Ooh, that's not a very good optic." So we still miss things all the time. But just one quick example: when we were writing our first book, Athena Rising, which is such a great affirmative title, we actually had a different title. We're willing to share that. Our working title was Guiding Athena. And, we thought it was such an awesome title. Of course, Athena is such a aspirational metaphor for women on the rise, but guiding is also a synonym for mentoring. And we thought, oh, awesome title. So we were almost to publication, and our editor, who was a woman, came to us. So it was our publisher, actually. And she said, guys, can we talk about this title? Have you really thought how Guiding Athena is going to land with women, how they're going to feel about the message they need to be guided? And it was like, light bulb, no. We were so focused on men that we just missed how this would land with women. And there have been so many of these examples all the way along. We feel like we're just always correcting course in this work.
But you're in the arena, right? And you are passionate about this cause. And I know you talk about how important it is as family. Things start at home with the family, and we just watched an amazing video of these young girls. And how do we, there's men out here in the audience as well as women that have children. And, I have a daughter who's in her 20s, but it's like, I don't want her to have to experience some of those things that I've had to experience and to pave that way. And so if you could talk a little bit about why it's so important that you have to start at home.
Yeah, I'll start, and maybe Brad, if you want to add a few things there too. And
sure.
It's interesting, the way we, first of all, how we approach caregiving, I think is one of the challenges here. And that is, if we always have this perception, right, and this is where it comes into the workplace too, is perceptions that women are the caregivers, right? They're the nurturers. And if we always see them that way, then that's going to lead toward bias and what we found in the first book, a withholding of access to resources like great mentoring and sponsoring. That this is one of the things that held men back, is their perceptions, the stereotypes they had about women as being caregivers. It meant they were risky investments. Like, why should I invest time and resources when she's a flight risk, right? I'm going to suddenly lose her. This won't shock you, but one of our interviewees, he said that, he even heard a guy say that, women were these, maternal time bombs, that they were going to suddenly go off and suddenly have babies all over the place. And it's like, no, dude, that's your perception, but it's not accurate. And so we need to have these conversations about some of the unconscious bias or the implicit associations we have that we automatically associate women as caregivers. Are they in a lot of cases? Yes. Should men be doing more of it? Yes. Do men want to be doing more of it? Absolutely. And so the research is really clear about this too, that men are asking for more. They want more of this. They have a hard time talking about it because it's really stigmatizing for guys, believe it or not, to talk about their caregiving responsibilities or what they want to be doing as parents in the workplace. And it's just kind of taboo to talk about family in particular ways, or that I have responsibilities when it comes to caregiving at home. A lot of the male allies that we talked to for the book said that, one of the best practices for guys is if you can, just be very vocal about talking about family with men and with women, but also when you have caregiving responsibilities where you might have to leave early or miss a meeting or whatever the case might be, is guys often would slink out the back door, just hush, real quiet about it. I don't want anybody to notice that I'm leaving. And that's not because they were afraid of what would happen at work. It was afraid of the stigma that goes with being attached to caregiving. So they said the best way to do this is to leave loudly. right? When you leave, it's like, hey, I gotta go pick up the kids. I gotta go take my kid to the doctor. I'm gonna take a day of paid sick leave today because my kid's sick and it's my turn to do those responsibilities at home. When you take your parental leave and take it all as guys, and make sure that on your out of office response, right, that you've got in there that, hey, I'm at home for the next however many weeks, bonding with my child and really enjoying that. So I'll see you when I get back. But we often as men are afraid to talk about these things. It's taboo. And we need to have more conversations with each other as well as for women, because it destigmatizes for guys and it normalizes it for everyone.
Yeah, no, that is so true. So we have a question from Melissa, and she asks, how do you demonstrate an incentive for men to want to be a part of the solution or to invest themselves in allyship? What incentive do they have to ostracize themselves or go against bro code?
Great question.
Yeah, boy, that's such a great question, Melissa. Thank you. This is not easy, right? And so how do we incentivize this? One of the things that we find, there are a number of influences on really reaching the everyday guy in the workplace in terms of getting him more engaged in equity work. And let me just give you some of the ingredients. Number one, are senior men talking about this? Are senior men role modeling this from the top? You just saw the general kick us off today for this session. That's good role modeling. In companies, we're always asking, if Dave and I are going to do a speaking event, we want to know if the CEO is going to kick it off, right? If it happens to be a guy, and it often is at the CEO level, is he going to lead off with a personal discussion of why this matters to him and why it's tied to the business? So if senior men are doing this, that really matters. Also, is there accountability? Do we hold people at the managerial level accountable? And this goes to all the kind of ranks, from general on down. Where's the accountability in terms of reaching milestones around equity in the workplace, around retention of women, around making the workplace a place that women want to come to, because we know the value in having gender diverse teams. So the accountability, I think, is really important. Dave kind of talked about, the business case, and he kind of talked about the WIFM, what's in it for the average guy. I think a lot of men miss that, don't understand it. One other thing I think is just to have a community of male allies in your workplace, right? So when I put some skin in the game and call something out or notice that something didn't land the right way with me in terms of the way it demeaned my female colleagues, it really helps to have a community of other men who will say, hey, go bro, go, or I'm glad you called that out in the meeting. If I have that support from women and men, that makes me more willing to lean in and disrupt.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for men to have women who are their allies, and they can even say, hey, do you realize what you just did? And kind of be that person that can keep you honest and isn't afraid to tell you when you've messed up. So Pierre has a question about, is this an issue that's gender? Is it based on age? So when you look at, the millennials versus your Gen X, your Gen Y, are you seeing a difference in the different age groups and how they're approaching this based on your studies?
It's interesting because I think that's an assumption that we all have, is that this is a problem related to the older generations out there. And certainly there are some traditional ideas about work and family and gender roles in particular that, again, those traditional ideals around that can be hard to overcome because people have been living and socialized in them for so long. But what's really interesting is you look at millennials and you look at Gen Z that's coming into our workforce right now. There's still just as many issues out there. One recent research study looked at the Gen Z in particular coming into the workforce, again, with this assumption that they're coming in with a more egalitarian perspective of relationships and gender roles, of how they what they demand and expect around work-family relationships. And while the attitudes are there, we don't see the behavioral change. So we're still dealing with this. And I think part of the challenge is that in many cases, for those of us who have raised some of those Gen Zers that are coming into the workforce, that, yeah, I think they are approaching it with those attitudes because that's how we raised them. But then they're encountering a very traditional workplace. And certainly around the military and national security, we are one of those out there that you run into this granite wall, and it's hard to move it. It's hard to shift. It's hard to change in that way overnight without making some real cultural change. And I think that's one of the challenges we have, is that we have to begin to examine how do we begin to shift the culture, right, so that it works for everyone.
Yeah, no, and being vulnerable takes courage, and how you change that culture. So, we're rolling up on about 4 minutes left, but I've got one more question for you, and then final comments, and I've got a quick poll, so I'm going to try and squeeze it all in, but don't know who asked the question, but it's a great question. How would you explain to someone the way to find the balance between mansplaining and mentoring if they've never been shown how to know the difference? Not everyone has that requisite self-awareness.
Yeah, that's such an amazing question, and let me just kind of say how I might explain it to my grandson first. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should probably use them proportionally. Right. So spend most of your time listening. And I think from all the research Dave and I did, women were really clear about this with us, that could you guys listen? Could you stop talking all the time? Could you stop trying to fix me? And, whatever I come in to talk to you about, I don't need you to fix things. Could you be a generous listener? And I think that if men would do that really deliberately, consciously, the mansplaining thing wouldn't happen so much, because I'm spending my time really listening. And it's only when she's done talking and I'm really focused on just hearing her. Once that's done, now I have the opportunity to say, so how would you like me to collaborate with you on this? Or what would be most useful for you? And then find that out from her, because she may just say, thank you. I just needed to bounce that off. That was exactly what I needed today. And if I do that, really focus on the listening, I just think I don't go down the road of mansplaining. I could also ask, honestly, am I doing this when women come in the room and not men? So Dave and I call this flipping the script, right? So if I feel compelled to give her more advice, ask myself, do I do this to the guys who come in here? Do I feel compelled to give them the advice, or is it more women? I got to have some self-awareness about that too.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. And in the listening piece is key, because sometimes we just want to talk, and we don't want you to solve our problems. We don't want you to fix it. We don't want you to be our knight in shining armor. We just want you to listen, understand, and then have that conversation if we need to have it. Yeah. So the Bordens, they'd like to know, how can I instill in my own daughters, their Gen Z, how best to encourage their male counterparts, both younger and older, to support them in roles that empower women in the workplace? So how do women move this forward?
Yeah. And again, I think in many ways, women have been doing this, right, for a long time. And this has been the challenge, because we haven't seen advances around issues around gender equity in the last 20 years. And actually, we've gone backward during the pandemic. But largely because I think women, for the most part, have been doing everything they could almost possibly be doing already. And this is why men have to come to the table and begin to do that. But I still think that, the conversation Brad and I love to have with groups of women about this topic about allyship is, how do you get the most out of this in the workplace? And that could be from a mentoring relationship. How can I get the most out of that, understanding that I'm leveraging a cross-gender mentoring relationship? And the same thing around allyship. How can I be in more friendships and more working with colleagues? And how can I collaborate in ways that, again, influences them, where I think part of it is just developing the trust and being able to enter into these kinds of conversations where you can be that gender confidant, that friend who can give you that unvarnished feedback when you step in and is like, hey, today when everybody cringed when you said that, here's why. And I think for guys, that we've got to learn how to respond to that in a way that shows that thank you. We really value that, and we care about, getting that kind of feedback, and it's a gift. And, gaslighting you in some way is not going to get us more of that, right? It's actually working against us. So I think developing that trust is really key.
Trust is so important. So I'd like to do another poll, and this one's on inclusivity. So if we can bring up the poll. Are the cultural values of your organization inclusive to all genders? And so right now, yes, 53%, no, 16, sometimes 21, and 11% aren't sure. So changing culture in an organization is so difficult. So what's your best advice about how do we shift and change the values and the culture of an organization?
A great question. And I think, again, you can't really kind of bite it all off at once. You gotta eat this elephant one bite at a time. And certainly working within the kind of the purview of your area. But I think from a broader organizational perspective, the research is pretty clear. So we've seen a lot of investment in all sorts of training to overcome some of these issues, certainly around harassment and assault. We've seen lots of that. In many cases, some of these actually backfire. They work against us because they're done in isolation. They're not connected to important parts of who we are in our business and the value system that we have. But the research does show that when you incorporate it into, for example, leader development programs, so being these skills and actions around what it means to be an ally or an inclusive leader, when you integrate that into a leader development program, because it's part of who we are and what we do, it makes all the difference in the world. Same thing when it comes to if you have mentoring and sponsoring programs, which I know you do, right? These are skill sets. These are things that you can weave in and integrate into part of the natural part of who we are. And that's where we begin to make culture shift, is when you're doing things that is part of the everyday of who we are and how we do things, because then it gets passed on to the next generation.
Yeah, no, that is so important. So as we wrap things up, they're going to put one more poll up on the screen, but what I'd really like from both of you, or what are your final thoughts that you would like to share with this group based on everything that we've talked about tonight?
Yeah, so many thoughts. And I just think that, the work that you all do is incredibly important, right? And it can't be left to, and again, not that the work that corporations, private corporations do is not important, because it is. But again, those of us who work in the world of national security, we have an extra, I think, added dimension to what we do and the importance of what we do. And we can't afford to be less than 100, whatever most effective or 100% effective is. And I know that we're accepting so much, when we're less efficient, less effective, when we're not doing this well, we're not being more equitable, because we're leaving talent somewhere else, and we're not getting to the best answers, the best solutions out there. And so I think, to me, this is not only a leadership obligation, but this is a moral obligation that we all have, for all of us who raise our hand and take that oath, which I think is most everybody on this call, that we have a moral obligation to do this.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think my final comment, Steph, would be, and this is a comment for men in particular, what worked for your father is not going to work for you in the workplace. And I just want to be really clear about that. 20th century leadership behavior is no longer valued in the workplace. And what does that mean for us men? We need to lean into relationships with women. We need to be more collaborative and democratic in our leadership approach, and that includes in the military. We need to have better empathy, better compassion. You know, many of these things that we have in our minds equated with women, well, guess what? Those are the things that most people say they most want in their workplace and they most value in leaders. So for men, surround yourself by a tribe of women who trust you, and you've got to do the work to earn that trust. And I guarantee you, if you develop trusting relationships with women who give you the feedback, you are going to be a more effective leader. And I'm going to go ahead and hypothesize that you'll promote more rapidly if you do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was so powerful, and I look forward to the continued discussions that we're going to have in our organizations. And I appreciate your time with us tonight. It was fantastic. And at this time, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Colonel Lynn Ray.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good evening, everyone. I'm Colonel Lynn Ray, and thank you for joining tonight's very spirited discussion. Opening remarks from General Townsend, Commanding General of AFRICOM, I believe really set the tone for tonight's discussion. General Townsend has added a new term to his own vocabulary, mansplaining, and acknowledged that men have got to be better influencers and change agents for that diverse, inclusive, and equitable community and workforce. This is a leadership issue, and leaders are both men and women. Please, everyone, join me in a virtual round of applause for both of our authors, Mr. David Smith and Mr. Brad Johnson, for taking on a very real and uncomfortable topic, laying bare both the shortcomings and the stereotypes that we must continue to strengthen and debunk, respectively. But I must say, the real heroine for tonight was Mrs. Stephanie Danzler, yours and my moderator. She did a wonderful job integrating questions, comments from you out there in the chat, as well as asking those tough questions of our panelists. Stephanie, fantastic job, and I'm always in awe of your talents. Coming next month, stay tuned for USAG Holocaust Remembrance Day, 9 April at 6 p.m. The link and Zoom webinar, as well as details, will be posted on USAG Stuttgart's Facebook page in the coming days. From Stuttgart, Germany, this is Colonel Lynn Ray. Enjoy your evening, stay safe, stay healthy and vigilant, and good night.